Good evening all, and welcome. Can we dream the future, predict the future, or know it? It can just be a feeling, or perhaps an apparition. Tonight we are going to be delving into the world of premonitions, and things are bound to get creepy. Just as a little note, if you are interested in becoming a patron after popular demand, I have extended the deadline for the special offer. However, you don't have to get the special offer if you don't want to. It's just there if you join the Emerald tier. If you're thinking about it, I would very much appreciate it, and it would help me out a lot. But anyway, without further ado, it's time to get comfortable. Open your third eye and let the darkness take control. Never ignore that sudden feeling you get when you need to get out of some place. Never, ever. It saved my life. I was at a party that doubled as a sending off party for me before I deployed, and there was an after party planned in which I was going to DJ along with some of my other friends. I did a short set at the party, then dropped some Yeah, I know I don't need a lecture, and ran around having fun with all my friends and my former production company. 2 hours later, I suddenly become absolutely dead sober and had that horrible feeling that we needed to leave and we needed to do it right that second. I immediately rounded up the friends I had and took everyone home and fell straight asleep. The next morning I was woken by a phone call. It was a friend telling me that at the after party, our friends had been ended by a psycho going through the house with a shotgun. That's where I would have been if I hadn't have got that feeling and went home immediately. This, for those of you who don't know, is the Capitol Hill Massacre, committed by 28-year-old Kyle Aaron Huff. He entered the rave and opened fire, finishing 6 off and wounding 2, and then turned on himself as he was being confronted by the police on the porch. It was horrifying. When I was very young, my parents and I were on vacation at our beach house, and I had a dream of my mother's friend. Her name was Jill, and she told me to tell my mother that she was finally happy. So the next morning during breakfast, I told my mum what this woman, who I never met, told me, and my mum immediately shot up and dialed a phone number on her phone. She later told me that her friend Jill was in hospital, and that the person on her phone had told her that Jill had passed away in the night I had a dream. Also in my freshman year of college, I had a dream about my dad getting into a car accident, and that morning I called my mum to make sure everything was okay. She said everything was fine and that I had nothing to worry about. Later that day, she called me and told me that my dad had gotten into a car accident. Nothing major, but the car was a bit ruined, and she was floored by what I had seen in my dream. My mother was a teenager, and had a dream where my Uncle Doug was banging on some large doors while laying down. He was trying to yell something but was injured badly. My mother says what woke her was the pounding noise on the door. She wakes up and runs to my grandparents' room crying. Doug's in trouble, he's hurt. She tries to explain her dream and they comfort her back to bed. Not long later, my mother wakes up again, but this time the knocks are real. My grandmother opens the doors to 2 policemen. They tell my family that Doug had been stabbed in the parking lot in a local bar and was in hospital. Apparently my Uncle Doug had some words with 4 of the other guys in the bar about his girlfriend. They went to leave and the 4 guys jumped him in the back of the bar. He yelled for his girlfriend to drive off and get help, so she did. But after the assault, he was found by one of the employees at the back of the bar, knocking with his little amount of strength on his stomach. They narrowly missed the main artery too. He still has visible scars that he's shown me. Take what you will from the story, but it creeps me out a lot. Around 8 years ago, I was on vacation with my parents and my cousin. My sister couldn't come as she had just started her first job, so she stayed home by herself. When we were children, both my sister and I used to be really close, mainly because we shared a room for the first 7 to 9 years. We used to have our code, with taps, for asking things like, "Are you asleep? Are they?" and stuff like that. She's also always doing something or looking for something to do, always being the first up. So when she was up and wanted me to wake up, she would place her face as close to mine as possible and stare at me. I don't know for how long she would stay like that for, but I can clearly remember multiple times waking to her doing this. I, of course, would shout or at least panic until realizing it was her. I guess it was fun for her, and I have to admit, I also did it a few times. So now we are on our trip, and it's been at least 10 to 12 years since the last time my sister pulled this prank on me. My sister and I are not as close as we used to be. We have constantly grown apart a little, but we still love each other. It was the last night in our trip before heading back to our city, and we just had to find this nice hotel close to the pyramids in Palenque, which meant no cell phone service. We were sharing a room, my mum and dad in the first bed and my cousin and I in the other one. At some point around 4 a.m, I woke up to feel the same old sensation of someone staring at me, so I opened my eyes and can clearly see a face. My immediate reaction was to shout, waking up my mother. I have to say that this sensation by itself is really scary, but years of experience with my sister waking me up like this took the threat away. So despite of my shouting, I wasn't scared. I was just too familiar. My mum turned on the light and asked me what happened. I told her that I was pretty sure my sister had just woken me up. I know it didn't make any sense, but I felt it was her, although I can't say I saw her face. I just saw a face and it disappeared. Immediately. My mum is really superstitious, so she just couldn't sleep after that, because she felt something was really odd, and I couldn't sleep thinking it was my sister. Later that day in the morning, we noticed we all had a lot of missed calls. My sister was involved in a really bad car accident. Luckily, she only had minor injuries, and to this day, I don't know what to make out of this experience. My brain tells me it was just a coincidence, but on the other hand, it's the only way I would have thought of my sister sleeping. It was just so real in between both of us. As an extra, on our previous visit to Palenque, my parents, my sister and I at the ruins, we heard drums. My parents said that it was raining, and that we were playing with the ponds, and that at some point the drums started playing. Out of curiosity, we followed the sound, getting us deeper into the jungle. I can't remember why we stopped, but when we finally made it to the exit and asked the security guard about the music, he said, "So you heard the drums as well?" He then proceeds to tell us that a lot of people have heard them at different times, and they don't know the source of it. When I was 18, my grandfather was having heart problems. I would wake up every morning and go to his house to see him. I would just talk to him, help him around the house and watch TV with him. He has been really lonely since my grandmother passed 3 months ago. I'll never forget this moment. It was June 7th. I arrive at his house, and my grandfather has the biggest smile on his face. I was so happy to see him smiling. He looks at me and says, "Guess what? I'm gonna go see my wife in 2 days." At the moment, I thought my grandpa had lost it. Believe it or not, my grandfather passed 2 days later in his sleep. The thought of it is scary, creepy, and disturbing. It was like he knew he was going to pass in 2 days. On a side note, the last 2 days he was alive, he was smiling and peaceful. I can't explain it. It felt like he knew something we don't know. When I was about 12, I had a terrible nightmare in which two aeroplanes collided in mid-air. It was extremely vivid, and I woke up in a panic. My bedroom was right next to the family bathroom, and after about 30 minutes of laying in bed freaking out, I noticed the landing light come on and knew that a parent was heading to the bathroom. Now by 12, I wasn't the sort to bother my parents about nightmares anymore, but I was convinced there was going to be a plane crash, so I rushed out to my mum and told her everything. She said that I was being stupid and that I should just read and try and fall to sleep. The next morning my mum comes rushing into my room and pulls me out of bed and has my dad with her. She asks me to tell him about my nightmare, and then they both looked freaked out. They insisted that I went downstairs with them to watch the news. I thought that they were pranking me or something, but when I got down to breakfast, the news was running, and it was about the Überlinger mid-air collision, in which on July 1st, 2002, Bashkiran Airlines Flight 2937, a Tupolev Tu-154 passenger jet, and DHL Flight 611, a Boeing 757 cargo jet, collided in the air over Überlingen, a South German town on Lake Constance near the Swiss border. All 69 passengers and crew aboard the Tupolev and the 2 crew members of the Boeing did not survive. We worked out that I'd woken up around the time that the crash itself took place. Nothing like this has ever happened since. I was working with a funeral director in my hometown, trying to spread awareness about addiction since I had lost my little sister to heroin/fentanyl. We got to talking one day and he said, "If the songs are playing on the radio, it's them." It struck me as odd at first, and then I started thinking about it and said, "Oh wait, I hear her songs sometimes, and there is always a tune to show it's her." Years went by and we hadn't spoken to him in a while. Then my mum kept getting sick. Turned out she had cancer. She claimed she beat it. Her breathing turned really bad, and I told her I'd take her to the ER, but she refused. She also kept grabbing at her back in pain. 2 days later, I got a feeling to call my mum. Then a baby cardinal landed on my railing in front of me, at the window, flapping its wings and screaming like baby birds do. I flew down to her new apartment. I had just moved her into there not a week earlier, and her car wasn't there. Then my phone rang, and it was the hospital. I flew there to find her intubated and brainwave counters, flashbacks to my little sister. My mum had serious pneumonia, and they found nodules on her lower back. I visited her daily, and the doctor thought she would pull through it. On Friday, April 27th, right before I was leaving for work at 5:45, the doctor called and asked if they could reintubate. Of course, I said yes. I pulled into work, and a very, very rare song came on the radio, and my stomach and heart dropped at the same time. I walked in and said, "If my phone rings, I have to..." And then my phone rang. The doctor wanted me to make the decision now. "Nope, I'll be there in 20 minutes with my uncle." My mum wasn't going to pull out of it with a happy life. My uncle and I decided to let her go with morphine. We felt guilty as hell, because his son and sister had previously died from ODs, and that was what we pretty much did. I'm so sorry for not letting my mum grasp for every breath. She was miserable, and I decided I wouldn't go back to hold her hand, because I was afraid that she would see that I had been crying and didn't want her to worry. My uncle said he would stay, and as I was leaving he told me to just remember happy thoughts. I got on the highway and Taylor Swift's Shake It Off came on. My mum loved the video of the cops so much that she would ask me to play it over and over. The next song on the same station was George Michael, Keeping the Faith. I sang it as a 7-year-old, a punch in the face, and my mum was laughing her butt off when she said I was singing all the wrong words. When I called the funeral director, he asked me how I was. The next question was, "Have you heard the songs?" I told him everything I told you, and I didn't believe the coincidences. His reply was, "Man, I've got the chills. Anything you see might be a sign from a loved one. If I get super upset, which is rare, I will get into my car and the song Just Breathe would be on. That's from my mum, because I played it non-stop after my sister's passing." One time during midterms, I went to bed around midnight but did not fall asleep. I lay there thinking about different concepts on the exam, and the next day, and being a worrywart. Plus, I was wired on coffee. All of a sudden, it's like all the ambient noise is turned down. My fan, the AC, my parents snoring, and a different noise begins to pervade the room. The sound was of a dozen women laughing cruelly and evilly at me. It lasted for a few seconds, then I lay there filled with terror trying to make out what just happened. I was trying to ignore it, but the fear was so high that I couldn't ignore it. A woman in her 20s ran into my parents' room and begged my mum to sleep in her bed, and my dad take my bed. They agreed, and the whole night I could barely sleep because I heard whispering in my ear. The next day something awful happened to my father. The thing with my family is that there is a history of the occult, not in my immediate family, but some extended family members, and they hate my family. I really believe they orchestrated what happened to my father using dark magic and came into my room that night to laugh at me, invisibly and malevolently. I know it sounds silly and crazy, trust me, and I've never believed all the stories my mum and aunt would tell me until this happened. It really opened my eyes to the supernatural, and I started having even more experiences. When I was 11 or 12, my older brother was 17 or 18 and was getting ready to go to a concert. He went to a lot of concerts and was kind of the rebel punk kid, so leaving late at night was not unusual. As he was talking to my mum about taking the car, I remember I became terrified. I was almost begging my mum not to let him go because I had this really bad feeling. I was convinced something bad would happen, and I had no real reason why. He was obviously getting impatient, and even my mum thought I was being silly. When I woke up next morning, my uncle had come over to make sure I was ready for school, because my mum had something to take care of. It wasn't until my lunch that my uncle came to school to pick up me and my sister, and explained that my brother was in hospital. He had been in a head-on collision with a semi-truck after falling asleep at the wheel on his way home. The first thing my mum said to me when I got to the hospital was something along the lines of, "I should have listened to you." I never had that happen to me before or since, and I'll never understand how it happened. All I know is that I have never been so convinced that something bad would happen, and the creepy part is that it did. He is better now, but at the time, no one would have believed it. First, they told us he wouldn't make it through the night, particularly without blood transfusions. Then they told us he'd likely never walk again. Fortunately for us, he proved both wrong. Now you'd never know anything had happened without him telling you. I was 13 years old at the time, and we were living abroad with my father. During our sleep, it seems that I got visions of my grandmother. We woke up and we saw bloodstains on our floor, like someone was walking towards us. Note that we did not see any animal or were we injured? We also got news that then grandmother passed away. It was sad, but at the same time we were scared, because we slept literally with our father the following night. The same thing happened years before with my grandfather's death. I somehow woke up at dawn and saw a shining man at the time, but shrugged it off and went back to sleep. Then our father gave us the news that our grandfather had passed away. It is creepy, but at the same time touching that they may have remembered us on their time of death. I still pray that they are all good in the next world. My father is an ex-officer who was a sniper and a shooting teacher while he was in the army. In my country, military service is mandatory. All men and volunteered women serve as soldiers for a period of time. But my father was a professional soldier until he retired. Thus it was his job to shoot a gun. Thankfully he retired when I was little, so I never really experienced his duties in the army. But although he was retired, he never stopped working for a day. He was a builder, taxi driver, bus driver, plumber. He opened shops. He had a lot going for him. He had been doing whatever he felt like doing for the last 15 years or so. While I was in 6th grade, 13 years old, he had a rent-a-car shop where he rented and sold cars. We had a large collection of cars, from old and rusty ones to 0-kilometer shiny ones. I used to help my dad in the shop. I took care of it while my father was doing other work, and I would call him when a customer came. The work wasn't that great. We wouldn't have more than 3 customers per day to actually rent a car, and most of the days we would go empty. But to my knowledge, things were going great. I was only 13 and didn't really understand the expenses of having a shop. This went on like this for a little more than a year. Then we shut up shop, and my father went to get another job with an overall loss. We were having economic difficulties before the rent-a-car too, but that shop made everything worse. Our then current state was so stressed, and we barely had money to satisfy our needs. We were never rich, but those days were probably the worst we have ever been. I remember not being able to buy new shoes after my old ones were unusable, and I didn't have spare shoes. Luckily for me, as a boy, my feet were the same size as my mother's back then, so I wore her seemingly unisex shoes for about a week before my mother could scrape together the money to get me a cheap pair. I was still happy and I loved my family. I never thought about why I couldn't be rich, but apparently it was different with my parents. They were struggling and in pain because they couldn't even buy a pair of shoes for their son. They felt humiliated and fights in the house. My mother was also retired and still working, but they simply couldn't pay the debts. I knew my mother was in great stress. But what I didn't see was my father was in stress of at least that size, if not greater. So, on one of those days on a weekend, I was in my sleep and having a nightmare. I remember every second crystal clear, and it's one of those 2 instances where I remember my dream that smoothly, even though years have gone by. My parents and I were in our car, driving on a casually crowded road, a large road that one would usually see between large cities. I was on the back seat as usual, and my mother was driving. I could see that she was panicked, constantly turning her head to look at my father, and I was panicked trying to see my father as well, when I finally decided to lean forward to see what was actually going on. I saw that my father had his pistol in hand, as he is authorized to carry it, and sometimes he would, but I'd never seen him holding it in public. Also, with his other hand he was holding his shoulder. I could see that the shoulder was wet and that my father was in pain, but there was no blood. The pain on my father's face was there, and he was applying pressure to the wound. It didn't make any sense at all, the lack of blood. Then somehow my father was sitting next to me in the back seat, and I was applying pressure too. Now I was sure that it was a gunshot wound. I could see it bleeding, but still no blood, and my father was bleeding water. I don't know how, but I was sure he'd been shot. He was shot on his left shoulder close to the heart. Then I woke up to the sound of my house's front door opening. That door was not oiled recently and would make a loud noise while opening. My room was on the second floor, and I could hear my father putting on his shoes, and I knew he was going to work. I was scared from the nightmare, terrorized even, and I called to my father with a questioning sound. Even though I was sure it was him from the sound of his shoes, I was affected by the dream and wanted to ensure that it was him. He called, "It's me," from downstairs, and then came up to my room to say goodbye before he left. I hugged him and began crying. He hugged me too, and after a while asked what was wrong. I told him about the dream and that he was shot and bleeding water, and there was no blood. Then I saw him panic too. He told me it was okay, and he stood with me until I calmed down, and he told me to go back to sleep. I was calmed and did as I was told. After I woke up later on, I told my mother about the dream. We were a Muslim family, and my mother has a book about Islamic dream interpretation, and she told me to check it. I don't remember what the meaning was, but she told me this: seeing blood in your dreams cancels out any meaning the dream might have, so if you see blood, don't try to give it meaning. And that was true according to the book. Years after this event, I thought about the scariest nightmare I ever had, and this came to my mind. When I asked my father if he remembered about that day, he calmed me down. He got serious and told me he could never forget it. Then he told me that he took his own pistol with him that day, and that he was not heading to work. Apparently he rented a guy 2 or 3 cars, and that guy came out to be the head of a mob. Rather, some kind of local mafia. Not only was he not paying the rent for over a month, but he was refusing to return the cars. In that kind of an economic and family distress, my father could not let go and decided to take his property back by force. He said that he knew they were also carrying weapons, and even though he was a well-trained soldier, likely with better speed and aim than any of those guys, they were crowded, leaving my father with 0 chance of survival. I would have most likely have perished that day, my father continued, and even if I survived, I would have lived the rest of my life in prison for what I had done. I was going to go destroy them if you hadn't have woken up. Your dream hit me like a slap in the face, and I realized what I was about to do and what I was about to sacrifice. I had no idea about those men or the size of my father's distress. He wouldn't really show me. He would usually try to keep me out of it, so my dream cannot be a memory about my father talking about it. I find it quite unlikely to have a dream like this. My family can explain it away by saying it's their religion. They simply believe in a God to help us. But I am not religious, and I have no way to explain this with science. I was very, very young. I couldn't have been more than 4 or 5 years old, but this has always been one of the clearest memories I have. I was sleeping in my little race car bed, but I woke up in the middle of the night for some reason. I remember looking down at the foot of the bed and seeing an old lady in a white nightgown, just sitting on the edge of my bed, soothing the covers out and smiling at me. I remember calmly getting out of bed, walking to my parents' room and telling them, "There's a lady in a white nightgown sitting on my bed." I explicitly remember saying that exact sentence that night. The next morning, my dad got a call saying his grandmother, my great-grandmother, had passed away in the middle of the night. As I got older, I learnt more about her, such as the fact that I was her first great-grandchild and she absolutely adored me. She also wore white nightgowns throughout the last part of her life. I really don't believe in the paranormal, but I am confident that I will remember what is not a dream. I think she visited me the night she passed, and my little kid brain didn't know how to rationalize it and just rolled with it. I think my grandma visited me shortly before she passed. She was in a hospice, so I left for Seattle for a week to be with my family and say my last goodbye. My last words to her were, "I love you." I think it was a few days after I returned that I was in my room and thought I saw some sort of misty blue thing from the corner of my eye. I looked up and it was gone. On the way back from work, I got a call from my dad and immediately knew what had happened. Dad and I had agreed that he wouldn't call me to tell me while I was at work, because this had been a rough loss for me, so that's how I knew. Since then, I've been absolutely certain that it was her visiting me to say bye. Dad told me once that he saw a ghost of my great-grandfather over my crib once when I was a baby. I guess that's just how our family do it. I'm still a pagan but no longer Wiccan. When I was still practicing Wicca, I was holding an Ebscat, which is a full moon ritual. Basically, the full moon is supposed to be the time when our magical energy is at its highest. So different rituals like drawing down the moon or other spells might be done on these nights. I did Esbats on full and new moon. New moons, for me at least, were new beginnings and things like that. Anyway, I was also big into Hecate, and at the time had an altar to her by my bedroom door. We also had a pet dog. I read that dogs were sacred to Hecate, and I was pretty freaked out to see that, during the ritual, my dog cowered at any time she walked in front of the altar, but was fine when she was away from it. I tested this a few times, and when she cowered, every time I ended the ritual and took apart the altar. I'm into divination, mainly tarot, and have a few predictions that have come true. I've read for one of my friends, and she said that my readings were pretty accurate. One time I was messaging my dad, and we were talking about family history. Apparently some of the women in the family had reputations for seeing the future. I've never actually spoke to him about divination, but I told him that it must run in the family because I can too. I then told him about the time I had a dream where my best friend since childhood had a daughter, and that after having the dream, she told me she was pregnant, and a few months after that, we learnt she was having a girl. I also do oracle card readings from time to time. They're similar to tarot, but unlike tarot, they tend to have a phase on the card or a title, and you look it up in this book that comes with a deck to get a full message. A lot of times the decks, or their themes, are lighter and more fluffier than tarot, but my Halloween deck and my Oracle Light and Dark and Shadows deck are both nice and balanced. When I was having trouble with my mum's divorce, I did an oracle reading with my Halloween deck, and wound up getting a message that seemed like it was meant for her, so I passed it on. This was the second time I did an oracle card reading for myself, and got a message for someone else. I was born legally blind, meaning I only have about 30% sight in one eye. I have also had second sight since birth, meaning I have been able to see spirits that have passed away. These were people I could not have known or met in my lifetime. I have done readings for everyone, from a random nurse at a hospital to a psychiatrist to my own family and friends. After the readings, I have made true believers out of many of them. One of the biggest disbelievers that I had was my own brother. This story is mainly about him. I have seen and spoken to my dead uncle ever since I was a very young child. I can't remember a time without him, but sadly my brother did not believe in this kind of thing. When I was 16, my brother had come to Virginia to visit my mother and I, because he lived with my grandmother. I had mentioned my uncle, and my brother had stated that he didn't want to believe that I was talking to David, even though my mother adamantly told him that there was no way I could have known what I knew about the accident and about his passing. My uncle got sick of not believing me and told me, "Let's play a game with your brother." He told me to repeat exactly what he said to me. I took my brother to the side of the gathering and spoke to him quietly, with my mother listening to this odd conversation. He told me to tell my brother that he would break up with his girl, the one he was there with, and that he would get back together with someone that he already knew. My uncle said that she would already be pregnant by another man. This child will obviously not be his, though he would raise it as his own. I also told him that the baby's name would begin with a K. The second child would be his and be a boy. The final prediction was that the next pregnancy would be twins, a boy and a girl. I told him the girl would be born first and that the boy would have breathing issues but would be okay by the end of the night. My brother then laughed, went about his business, as I told him all of these predictions would obviously take some time to come true. When I was 16, I said all of this, and around the time that I turned 24, my brother was having his twins, and everything I'd said had come to pass. Each of my premonitions was fulfilled to the fullest extent. My brother had gotten back together with an old girlfriend from school. She was already pregnant by a married man, and then she gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. The second pregnancy was a boy, and it was his child. And third and fourth came the baby twins, like I said. The beautiful baby girl born first, followed by a handsome boy who had slight breathing issues. And my brother finally had to admit that he believed me. He proceeded to call me that night and asked me if his little boy would be okay. I said yes, and he would be off the machine before sundown, and he was. There was no way I could have predicted 4 children's births correctly, and years before they even thought of it. No matter what readers or listeners think, my uncle has been a huge part of my life ever since I was born. My mother would walk in my room at night, and I would be smiling and laughing in the dark for no reason, when she thought I would be terrified. At a very young age, I began to have out-of-body dreams, where a man would come and take me away to play games. I didn't know who he was, but I knew I was loved. One day in my grandmother's house, my mother was going through photos, and she saw one of my dead uncles. When I picked the photo up, it was like getting punched in the stomach. I whispered in my mother's ear urgently that this was the man I was seeing. She then told me that it was impossible because he died before I was born. This opened a huge new world for my mother. She now knew he was safe, that we do find each other, and that he loved her enough to stay and look out for her. This was a gift of great peace. He asked me many questions that I could not know the answer to, and when I replied with the correct answer, it really creeped her out. It took her a long time to get comfortable with this. Just the other night she was laying in bed and whispered that she loved him and missed him. From in the kitchen across the house, I hollered to her, "I don't know why, but he said he loves you and misses you too." Maybe because I was born with almost no vision, that I was granted the gift of second sight. My dad worked a lot when I was younger. He had taken a second job delivering computer parts on the weekends, and since we didn't see him much, he would let me ride shotgun once a week. This 2-hour trip with my dad was the absolute highlight of my weekend when I was 7. I woke up Saturday morning stoked, getting dressed to see him as quickly as possible. We had a tradition. As soon as we started the route, there was a little Easy Mart he would take me to. Every time I got a pack of pink extra gum and one of those little convenience store ice cream cones. So this particular day I tell my mum bye, and when I get to the threshold of my home, I am stricken with fear. I am starting to cry uncontrollably, begging my mum to not make me go. I distinctly remember being more terrified than anything. My mum's all like, "Whoa, okay, chill out, sister. Nobody's forcing you." She goes back into the kitchen and makes breakfast while I play with some Barbies. Roughly an hour later, the phone rings. My dad did this mail route in an old Bronco too and heard a noise in the back seat. When he turned and looked, he saw nothing. He looked back to the road and saw a mailbox. Overcorrecting, he rolled the Bronco 3 times and slid across the road before coming to a stop. He left the accident bumped and bruised, computer parts littering the highway. The passenger side, the one that I had been riding in, was completely crushed in. The only thing they found in the vehicle was a pink packaging of extra gum. I would first like to say I have always been interested in the paranormal. I believe my experiences have something to do with them, and without them, I would probably be one more skeptic. I'm a 34-year-old female, born and raised in Virginia. My first and scariest experience happened when I was 5 years old. It was a weekend, and my sister and cousins had a sleepover. We were all sleeping on the living room floor with pillows and blankets everywhere. I had woken up around 3 a.m. to use the bathroom. The entire house was asleep, and as soon as I awoke, I had the feeling that I was being watched, so much that I had to have every light on and left the bathroom door open. As I was walking back to my place amongst my sleeping cousin and sister, I switched the lights off and left one light on in the kitchen and laid back down in between 2 of my cousins. Because we were sleeping on the floor, there was a room around our heads for someone to walk or sit. The moment I laid my head down, I opened my eyes, and there, right by my head, was this girl sitting about 5 inches from me. She had long, wavy brown hair and was wearing an old-fashioned nightgown with lace around her collar, but her face was non-existent. It was like looking into a black hole. Although I could see the hair that fell on her non-existent face, she was leaning one arm and looking down at me. I instantly felt a sense of dread. I was going to ask her who she was, but in that split second, something inside told me, don't ask her, because she will say your worst nightmare. So instead I threw the blanket over my head and prayed she would go away. It took me forever to fall back asleep, but I finally did. Being only 5, I assumed it was just a ghost. Fast forward about 16 years. I'm now at my mother-in-law's house. She had invited a Jehovah's Witness to come and talk. While they were talking about different religious things, I was back and forth from one room to another, and I would listen for a bit and then go back to whatever I was doing. They started talking about demons. Now this woman had no knowledge of me or the past experience I just mentioned. She began saying that demons can take the form of anything, except they do not have the ability to make a human face. She said the human face is a holy thing, and that a demon will just look like a black hole. Obviously, I was in shock. Up until that moment, I thought I had just seen an ordinary but terrifying ghost. The dread feeling that I felt when I saw this thing was like pure evil. My other experiences aged 10 laying in bed trying to fall asleep was when something whispered in my ear. I could not understand what was said. This is not the only time something whispered in my ear. The house I lived in when my son was born was definitely haunted. Although my husband, sister-in-law and her boyfriend lived there, I was the only one to ever experience anything. I was always up late and alone, since my son was only weeks old. I would stay up, and he'd wake up at 2 a.m. for feeding, after which I would go to sleep. I always felt like something was there, and that I was definitely not alone. One evening as I bent over to pick up my son from his bouncy chair, whatever was there whispered in my ear saying, "Hello." Now I could feel the breath hit my ear when this happened. If I had closed my eyes, I could have sworn it would have been an actual person. Another evening, not too long after this whisper, I was doing the dishes. Everyone was home, but they were all in their rooms watching TV. I heard my sister-in-law stand behind me, and she said my name, Sandy, like she wanted my attention. I turned around and said, "Yeah?" But nothing. I was completely alone. Now, by this time, everyone knew about what I was experiencing, and it was kind of an ongoing joke in the house. I think the spirit was drawn to me because I had my son. Maybe I was more sensitive to the other side because of that, but honestly I don't know. Another night I was in my bed feeding my son, and it was a little after 3 a.m. The room was completely dark, and my fan was on. I was still a little warm, so I was staring at my fan, and thought to myself, when he is done eating up, I'm gonna go and push the button to make the fan oscillate. All of a sudden it started moving back and forth, as if no one had touched it. I was the only one awake, and I was staring at the fan when it happened. Obviously this spirit was helpful. Like I said, I never felt like it was harmful or evil. I had a dream one night that I was talking to my grandfather's sister. Her name was Denise. Now in my dream she looked very sick. She was sitting in a chair and I stood next to her. I asked her what was wrong and she said, "I don't know, I keep having these seizures." I asked her if she was going to be okay and she said, "I don't know." That was the end of the dream. Now at the time Denise lived in Florida, so I never saw or spoke to her, and I'd never dreamt about her before. The morning I woke up, I called my mum to tell her about this random dream. My sister answered the phone and I said, "Where's Mum? I need to talk to her." That's when my sister tells me that my mum had flown to Florida the night before because Denise was reaching the end of her tether. Up until that time, I'd never had a dream like that before, nor since. Let's hope it stays that way. My mother is a bit superstitious, and has always told me that we have something special going on with the spirit world. My whole life, weird stuff has been happening, so I think she might have a point, although there is surely a scientific explanation out there. I've always had a feeling that something is watching over me. The first incident I can remember that happened to me was when I was little and playing on a beach at our cabin. I was sitting under a tree alone playing in the sand, when all of a sudden I heard a strong snapping sound from the tree above me. I looked up and couldn't see anything. I stood up to get a better look, and there was this strange feeling, like a huge urge or someone pushing me. "Move, go somewhere, just move." I took a few steps and a huge branch dropped right where I was standing and stuck in the sand. I got startled, so I just stared at it for a moment, pulled it out of the sand, and ran inside to tell everyone. I got the "yeah, right" treatment. The sand was very fine, and it had good enough velocity and was enough weight to stick to the sand, so I guess the damage was done. It had hit me in the head. It was also so pointy and straight that my grandfather took it as a walking cane for his forest walks. I've had similar guidances throughout my life that I can't explain rationally. My mother has told me about similar incidents that she's had. The creepiest I can remember happened at my childhood home, as my parents had just moved into the house. She was cooking dinner and felt something behind her. She turned as she thought my dad had gotten home without her noticing, but there was no one there. She kept cooking, and there was clearly a presence behind her, with breezes of air and temperature changes as it moved. My mum, freaked out, left the food there and walked out the kitchen. The presence followed her to the corridor and started guiding her towards the room in the hallway. It was a bedroom that was still full of moving boxes, and she had an urge to go stand in a corner as she felt increasingly uncomfortable, as if something was in the room, but the corner was safe. Suddenly, she had a strong thought to look down, similar to my experience with the branch. Just this strong, commanding, "look at the corner," in her head. She looked at the corner and saw a glimmer between the floor and the wall. There was a golden necklace in the crack, and she picked it up, and the presence was gone, and she felt filled with a safe, warm feeling. She still has that golden necklace, and has no idea who it used to belong to. My family has a long history of mental illness. Therefore, whenever we get calls from family members, we assume the worst. It happened multiple times. First, my cousin was pregnant, and she was super excited for the birth of her baby. It was around the 5th month, and my mother and me started to hallucinate and see dark figures in the shape of a baby around my house. Since it happened to both my mother and I, we both got scared, and did nothing about it. About a week later, my cousin miscarried, and we stopped seeing these apparitions. Secondly, my grandma was very sick, and my mother and I started hallucinating again. This time, instead of babies crawling around corners, we saw slumped figures. Not even a week passed, and my grandma had perished after they told us she was recuperating. Finally, and probably why my mother and I are not scared of these apparitions, my sister had been diagnosed with depression for a long time. Since she is older, she lived in another country, and my mum and I were in the kitchen of the hallway with all the lights off, and we simultaneously freaked out, and we saw a figure that reminded us of my sister. My mum took this as a warning to call her immediately. Her roommate answered, and my mum asked her to check on her. Turns out my sister had tried overdosing on sleeping pills, and her roommate found her with just enough time to save her life. Ever since then, I believe that whatever this apparition is, it's probably someone or something that's trying to help us by giving us a warning beforehand. I had a nightmare one night before my friend passed away, where death, represented by a tiger, trapped me and scratched my hand before leaving. I woke up feeling completely unsettled all day and was crying. I had this lingering feeling that something bad was going to happen. The next night, another dream, but this time in a shadowland. There were 5 people, one to my right who I couldn't see, and one after them named Ben, and 3 more that were just shadows I couldn't make out. I don't know how I knew, but I knew this place represented death or some kind of other world. The person to my right asked, "Do you really have to go?" to Ben, without speaking to it. Then I woke up and cried. I thought it was the end for me. The nightmare didn't feel like nightmares, they felt like premonitions. I wrote both dreams down in an online journal I keep, and I told my ex that it was going to be the end for me. I wanted people to know that I felt it coming. I got the call later in the morning that my friend had passed. The craziest thing is that it was completely sudden and out of the blue. She was young and healthy, or so I thought. I'm a strong believer in the pliability of the brain. You can completely fabricate existences to protect your psyche. If I hadn't written down the experiences in a date-stamped online post or spoken to my ex about it, I would have convinced myself that I made the story up in my mind after the fact that I had to cope with her passing. Once, about 7 or 8 years ago, I was on a road trip with my family. We had a wonderful vacation in Disney World for a week, and we were driving back home to Houston from Orlando. I had fallen asleep in the back seat, and I have no idea how long I had been asleep for. I swear 100%, hand on the Bible, I remember having the most vivid dream of burning alive. It was so hot, and I just felt the fire burning me. I could hear it crackling, and I could hear a faint scream. I could even smell the smoke in my dreams. I thankfully awoke when my mum had to slam the brakes pretty hard. I wake up sweaty and anxious. There was just something off. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. I asked my mother why she slammed on the brakes, and she said something about traffic starting randomly on the freeway. We are in this slow, bumper-to-bumper traffic for 10 minutes. This was enough to let me catch my breath and reflect on my dream and tell my family what I'd seen. Then we came up to why there was random traffic. A car had slammed into the pillar of an overpass and was entirely engulfed in flames. No ambulance, no fire trucks, no police, nothing had arrived yet. Just Samaritans pulled over trying to help whoever was inside to get out. Immediately I knew they weren't alive, and I was just experiencing what they had experienced. I burst into tears. Never will I forget it. Premonition, glitch, who knows what it was. I hope their passing wasn't difficult. This story was told to me by a professor who I trust very much. While he was camping and hunting in Montana, he had a strange vision. He was sitting on a hill looking for a deer to shoot, and out of the forest walks his elderly mother. He's taken aback because his mother lives in Slovakia and has never left her country. His mother says she loves him and walks away. At this point, my professor is freaking out. He packs his stuff and goes back into town and calls his mother overseas. She answers and laughs at his story. He still feels unsettled, so he gets a flight and flies back to see her. He spends a few lovely days with her, and then the morning before he's about to go, he wakes up to find his mother has passed in her sleep. My professor grew up in war-torn Europe, escaped the Iron Curtain, and lived as a street artist in Paris. Then became a 10-gallon hat-wearing Slovak in Texas. But somehow, this story sticks out a lot when I think of him. Rest in peace. When I was a child, my mother had a dream that I got taken and I went missing. She then started getting photos of me through the post, crying. And eventually there was a huge search party out for me. They found my remains in a cornfield, in my Thomas the Tank Engine pajamas, covered in blood. Obviously my mother was very upset about this nightmare, that she told a few friends and family, but she left one horrible detail out of the dream. So 2 weeks later, I come screaming into my mum's room, saying I had a nightmare, and I told her in my dreams this man took me, beat me. He kept taking pictures of me, and then he took me out to the back fields and bit off all my fingers before ending me. That one horrible detail my mother didn't tell anyone was that they found my body with all my little fingers missing. My mother threw my Thomas the Tank Engine pajamas out that morning. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's installment about premonitions. I don't think I've done this topic in a while. It's a fun topic, and I thought I'd just unload every story I had in one go. So right now it's about an hour and 8 minutes, so I suppose it's about 50 something minutes long. So it's a nice longer video for you guys to enjoy. If you did enjoy it, don't forget to drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe if you're new, and press the bell icon for good measure as well. And if you liked this topic, do let me know, because the comment section is where I go to see what I should do next, or what stories I should be looking for. So that'd be pretty awesome. If any of you have a story that you would like to share, you can forward it to my email, post it to my Reddit, and be sure to include plenty of punctuation, paragraphing, and description to maximize the chances of your story being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.